Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. Today in this video I am going to give details about the first 10 greatest existential threats to America. If you haven't watched my introduction video where I listed out all 50 of the greatest threats, please do. And if the president or his staff are watching this video, I can only express my gratitude again. These first 10 are somewhat foundational to all of the others, so I have a lot to say in this particular video. And with that, I'm going to just get started right away. And again, I have to use the glasses. Number 1 is cults and cult mentality. About 30 years ago, I lost someone who was very near and dear to me to a cult. I watched how cult mentality just takes over a person and turns them what you could call insane. They totally detach from reality, and they detach from everything that is good in life. They end up moving forward, wasting their life in the pursuit of phantoms that exist only in their mind and in the group collective. To explain what a cult, and particularly what a cult mentality is, let me attempt to do that for you. Clean these glasses. Humans are social creatures. I think we all know that. They are also tribal. The basic tribe would be the family. You know, married couple, for example, spouses. We are tribal by nature. We feel an innate concern. There's something special about our blood. Not just our blood, but even our friends. Not just that, but even our neighbors, if we've been around them and we spend time with them, which we don't do much in America anymore. In other words, the people who you know become personally special to you, whereas the strangers out there are not. That's because it's just innate in humans that we are tribal creatures. And that is a good thing, because there's power in numbers, particularly power of defending yourselves. And the power to create, to benefit each other, mutual beneficial agreements and such. When tribalism is taken to extremes, however, then it begins to become a cult. Then it begins to detach from reality. It no longer serves the people who are in it, it oppresses the people who are in it. And there's always a fine line between a safe and secure tribal aspect and what you could call a cult. I'm not going to say you can just check off these boxes and there you go, that's a cult. But once you understand how cult mentality works, that's the telltale sign that it's gone from tribalism to a cult. So what is cult mentality? Humans have another feature other than tribalism. They are intelligent. They are able to think. They can gather and process and memorize and recall information at will. They can analyze information. They can think about information to come up with new information. And ideally, you're going to come up with something that we call truth, which is something that is consistent with reality. Animals, to some small extent, the monkey figuring out how to stack boxes to grab the banana, yes, you could argue that they are thinking to some extent. But if you don't grasp that humans have a capacity that goes light years beyond that, you might want to go read some preliminary material before listening to what I have to say here. What a cult mentality is when you, as a human being, abdicate that massive capacity between your ears to think competently. You abdicate that, either voluntarily or because someone's manipulated you into it and you don't know it. You abdicate that ability to think critically in favor of some prepackaged set of answers or a dogma. Okay, so in other words, instead of thinking things through on each case-by-case basis, you just pull out a heuristic. You just pull out a rule of thumb. If they're black, then they're inferior. Okay, that's where a racist comes from. They've abdicated their ability to think critically. Thinking critically would say, well, they have darker skin than I do. Does that matter? Does that have any particular impact on what they are as a person? And as you think that through, you figure out, well, no, it doesn't mean anything at all. It just means they have darker skin, right? if you're in a cult, you're going to have a prepackaged dogma, an answer that says they're black, therefore they're inferior. They're Jewish, therefore they are inferior. Things like that. So that's what a cult mentality is when you lose your ability to think in favor of just taking the easy route because somebody told you that. And that's one of the features of cults that most people associate with cults, is that somebody is feeding you all those answers and the dogma and the doctrine. And we call that person a cult leader. But not all cults have to have a leader. Cults can exist on their own. The thing is, both a cult and cult mentalities are founded on an inability to think properly. There's something dreadfully wrong with what you might call the computer of their brain. Now, my background's computer science. Anyone who tells you that the brain functions like a computer is lying to you. The brain is far more capable than any computer we will ever devise, certainly more than anything that exists now. When you have a powerful tool like that you carry around with you everywhere you go, and you just turn the thing off in favor of, blind following of somebody or some idea without actually thinking about it, you are exhibiting cult mentality. Now, this permeates the nation because as a free country, people have been allowed to go out and seek what they like the best. Because of that, they might like the self-help movement over here. Okay? And what happens is the self-help movement becomes a cult. They might say, well, I'm going to look for the answers, I'm going to go to school, and I'm going to study. And they get caught up in academia. Academia is one of the very most devastating and dangerous cults in America today. Someone else might just kind of live through life partying and surfing, but they have to have a job, so they get a quick journalism degree, they go get a job with some news agency, and they start doing their job in there. And as they do so, they start to build a cult mentality. Here's how it's done. Don't think about it. Don't even introduce morality or ethics into it. This is how it's done. You will do it this way. And those people who agree to that and they say, okay, I'm going to follow along, and then they start spewing forth that same nonsense, and they start teaching the younger generation, this is what journalism is, that's a cult. So what you have in the mass media, especially the national televised mass media, is a cult mentality. These people are completely detached from reality. And that's why when you point out what fake news is, for example, a lot of them honestly don't understand what you're talking about. Any more than if you went up to a member of Jim Jones' cult and you told them, you know what, you're a member of a cult. They're not going to get it. They're not going to understand that. They have replaced the ability to think competently with something else. So the self-help movement in the 80s was one of the most devastating. All these gurus came up, you know their names. You know their names. And the fact that you know their names tells you something right there. Remember, many cults, but not all, many cults have leaders. And if you see a cult mentality starting to form, it will attract people who want to become leaders of that cult. They have a ready-made audience right there. And that's where a lot of these people crawled out from under a rock and came out and put on a suit and tie and started telling you how to be, have the awesome power, all these. I'm not even going to go there, but the New Age movement also, especially in the 70s, the 80s, and up till now, without a doubt, it's just getting worse and worse. The New Age movement has nothing to do with reality. The people there have detached themselves from reality. Everything is spiritual and vibrations and this and it just, the world that they in is a different world than the one that those of us who are standing on terra firma are in, right? That is a cult mentality, and different people take it to different extremes and different levels, but it's a cult mentality. When someone tells you that you need to increase your vibrations, do you think that's a person who has got their gears moving and their computers functioning properly? Or does that sound like a cult member who has been told you need to increase your vibrations, and even if nobody on earth actually knows what that means, they're going to repeat it to you anyway? That's a cult mentality. Scientology, holy moly. Scientology is absolutely devastating. If you don't understand what that is, you need to research it. It's more than just Tom Cruise acting like a freak show. That is a very dangerous one. There's a lot of evidence that people are being hurt and possibly worse in that particular group. You also have, of course, the Jim Jones type cults, what we consider a more traditional cult. But that is a rarity in the cult world. Most cult activity in this world, and in this country in particular, takes place right up here. People walking down the streets who never meet with a particular group are exhibiting cult mentalities left and right. Literally left and right. The far left, the radical left, that is a cult. These extreme people on the right, which there aren't as many as there are on the left, or at least they don't make themselves known, that's a cult. Okay, they're cult mentalities. What a cult does, I mean, think about what a lot of these cults were. Self-help, and yet it promotes powerlessness. You're dependent upon this cult, this guru, to tell you what to do. Victimization movement. Oh my gosh, I'm a victim. Me too. I'm a victim. Oh my gosh. That's not promoting self-sufficiency and confidence. The New Age movement. Okay, they're claiming to promote enlightenment, but they're promoting the exact opposite. They're promoting insanity, total detachment from reality. There's no light there. That's darkness. These cults promote things like insanity, victimization, powerlessness, and incompetence, but they do so using a certain type of rhetoric, euphemisms and such, that pretend to promise you the very opposite of what they give you. In the process, they annihilate a person's independence, their competence, to some extent their sanity. You could argue their sobriety, and I don't mean that they're using drugs or alcohol necessarily, but what's going on in their mind has clouded their ability to think. They're impaired the same way that someone who is, intoxicated would be, in terms of their ability to think properly. It annihilates personal responsibility. Once you get into a cult mentality, someone else has the answers. It's no longer up to you to figure things out yourself. Someone else hands it to you on a silver platter, and you run with it, to whatever extent you run with it. And along those lines, self-sufficiency. You're going to lose all self-sufficiency. As I said before, academia is one of the most dangerous cults in America today for various reasons. I can't talk about everything in these videos, so forgive me if I leave some things hanging. That's not my intent. But in particular, the peer review process. And I believe I talk about that later, but peer review process, what is a peer? A peer is a member of your group. There's some, if you're in a marching band, then if you play trombone, then someone who plays the snare drum is your peer. In school, they're your peers. Okay, now that you may or may not get along with them, but generally speaking, you're part of the same group, part of the same class of people. The last thing you can expect from that person, unless they're an absolute enemy, is that they're going to critically analyze what you're doing. In academia, what they call peer review is actually good old boy review. See, they're not handing peer review off to someone who, in real legitimate science, the purpose of another person reviewing your science is that they are to tear it apart. They're to grab a small, I don't think I have one here, but yeah, I do. They're to grab a small screwdriver and to just take the whole argument apart, to take your research apart. They go in with a magnifying glass. They go in and they dust for prints. Okay? They tear your science apart and they look for anything that is wrong with it. And it's not because they hate you or anything, it's because they want to know the truth. And then they publish the results. And if they come up with too much dirt on what you're doing, then the publisher should say, no, we're not going to publish this. There's too many problems with your research. That is true review, not peer review, but true review in legitimate science. In academia, what you get is some good old boy, someone at a university who's in exactly the same situation you are in, who is in the same massive nationwide cult that you're in, the ivory towers of academia. They review your work. Well, then it becomes a matter of, well, I personally agree with what this person's saying, so I'm not going to look too hard for problems. I know I'm right, so therefore he's right. We can fudge a few things here and there. We don't, and it goes all the way up to some of the worst offenders in this, where they get the review, they get the paper they have to review, and they just approved, and it's done. Academia is a nasty cult that is damaging this country badly. As I said before, the fake news, the mass media is a cult. It functions as a cult, and it does have some leaders in it. but it's one of those cults that it's not quite leaderless, but it's close. Um, cults and cult mentalities, especially these victimization, self-help kind of things, they promote just irrational thinking and idiotic doublespeak. For example, I've heard people, like I saw one woman, I don't know where, but one of these shows or something, and she brought a second man into her marriage. Didn't bother to ask her husband about it. She's, I don't know, new age, whatever it is, but something in her mind justifies bringing another husband in. And then she said something along the lines of, when her husband was like devastated by this, she said, "Well, I can't make him feel bad. Only he can feel bad. That's his problem." Okay, when you're thinking that way, you are detached from reality. You can make another person feel bad. When someone loves you dearly and you do that to them, it breaks their heart. And if you don't recognize that, you are the one with the problem. And that's a classic example of cult mentality. Cult mentalities are often used to make money. Obviously, look at all the gurus and out there in the self-help movement and things like that. You look at Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard was just grabbing as much money as he could. As much as he could. And the insiders close to him made it very clear why he was doing that. Because the more money he has, the more ability he has to avoid being caught, captured, prosecuted, imprisoned for the things that he was doing. Money is power. He didn't want it to necessarily go out and buy everything in the world. He just wanted that security to make sure he maintained his power over these people. And cult mentality, because you're depriving yourself of this greatest of all tools that you will ever have, it renders people, in the extremes, it renders them absolutely useless as citizens, as parents, as friends, as neighbors, as co-workers, as reliable other members of your nation, your community. Cult mentality does bad things to people. I mean, I don't know how to emphasize that enough. To give you an example of the difference between a cult mentality, two people doing the same thing, but one's doing it with a cult mentality and one is not. In World War II, the Nazis, when they were fighting, they took an oath to the Führer. They took an oath to him personally. Not to the government, not to Germany, not even to the Aryan race. They took an oath to Adolf Hitler, the Führer. Everything they did, all that fighting, all that dying, all that losing their arms, they did for the Führer. That's insane. That's a cult mentality. And yet, the American soldiers went through the same pain and suffering and deprivation. They went out, they lost their arms, they suffered, they had shell shock, they were dodging artillery. They're all doing exactly the same thing, but why did the American soldiers did it? They did it mainly for two reasons. Well, three. To protect their nation, because they were attacked at Pearl Harbor. To defend their own families, their neighbors, their communities, their country. They also did it to, I'm losing sight of where I am here. They also did it for ideals. The ideals of what our country stands for. Freedom. And these are very general ideas. They're not things that dictate the terms of existence for people. They're very general but good ideals. Freedom. What's represented by the Constitution, etc. And the third reason that Americans fought was to save the life of the men to their left and their right, and in front of them and behind them. Those people in those units and in those squads, those platoons, those battalions, they were like brothers. And if nothing else, they were there to fight alongside their brothers. That's very different than what you see in Nazi Germany. Now, yes, they did have that kind of brotherhood once they get into the battlefield. But the reason they went there in the first place, the reason they were willing to die, ultimately, at least certainly in the beginning, was for the Führer. It's crazy. That's cult mentality. That's why they started the war. They started the war, in case you didn't know that. They're the ones who went and invaded these other countries who was hurting nobody. They went out and did that in service of the Führer, in service of their cult. Cults have an obsession with fearing outsiders. People who are not members of the cult are to be feared. In the worst examples, they are to be blamed, to be avoided, to be persecuted or punished, even exterminated. And you'll see this in any tightly established cult. There's always this cultivation of a fear of outsiders. Jim Jones, when he moved his group down to Guyana, that was it. Anyone who comes from the outside is to be feared. Report them. Report them. We'll send our people with guns out there. They even killed, I believe it was a state senator from California who went down there to see what was going on. They assassinated him. He was an outsider. Okay, cults are very, very dangerous. Cult mentality is very, very dangerous. Now, if you look at the radical left today, for example, just one of the many insane things they've done over the last 3 years, calling for members of their group, which is members of their cult, to go and harass Republican senators and representatives while they're out eating dinner. Now, if you don't recognize that that is loopy, that that is sheer insanity, then you need to maybe evaluate what your status is with cult mentality. Most normal, stable, sane, rational people would recognize that that is an act of sheer insanity. That's lunacy. Nobody's going to obey a command like that unless they have lost the ability to think for themselves. They are blindly following a doctrine, a dogma, prepackaged answers of a cult. How can you give a better example than that? Who would waste any moment of their life going out to harass somebody eating dinner because you disagree with them politically? That's insane. If that's how you want to spend your life, then your life is already over. So you might as well not do it, because there's no point. Your life is over. You're a member of a cult. Another aspect of culthood is that we used to have real heroes in this country. And I'm going to talk about heroes in another segment of this. But real briefly, we used to have real, true heroes. People who accomplished something of significance. And therefore, they were inspirational to us. But even someone like a Charles Lindbergh, you know, maybe people wanted to go shake his hand and get his autograph if he was in town. But they didn't just build this whole cult around Charles Lindbergh. He was a hero. He was an inspiration. And then you went out and did your thing. You were inspired to go out and seek greatness on your own. But today what we have are these prepackaged pop culture icons. And a good example of that would be someone like Carl Sagan. Now, Carl Sagan, I was sucked into that one when I was a kid. I was so into science. And this is before I realized that Carl Sagan was more or less a junk scientist. He was part of this academic cult, but I didn't know that as a kid. So, you know, watching Cosmos, reading the book Cosmos, studying astronomy, astrophysics. I even wanted to go study with Carl Sagan at Cornell, but I didn't, and I'm grateful that I never had that opportunity, because someone else did. Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Now, when Carl Sagan left the scene, somebody was going to fill that void, an heir apparent. Okay, now the question is, you don't know who this person is yet, right? Someone's going to fill Carl Sagan's shoes, an heir apparent. If you don't even know who that person is, then what exactly have they done to deserve that honor? What, in other words, let me phrase it this way. What have they accomplished? How do you know that somebody's going to fill these shoes if you consider Carl Sagan a hero? Carl Sagan wasn't a hero. He was a pop culture icon. He built himself. Cornell helped to build him. He worked in a symbiotic relationship with NASA to build him. And let's face it, he was a likable guy. When you listen to him talk, you love to hear him talk. His enthusiasm was contagious. Of course, what he's talking about mostly wasn't exactly true, but I don't think he even realized that. Because junk science had already infiltrated, we'll talk about junk science in a moment, had already infiltrated academia to the point where what people who call themselves scientists don't even know that they're conducting junk science. See, it's just a big thing. So when Neil deGrasse Tyson came along as an understudy of Carl Sagan, all he had to do was kind of be personable and not offend people, and he's got the job. He is the new Carl Sagan. He can make the new Cosmos. He didn't have to actually accomplish anything because there was a cult built around Carl Sagan. And when you have a cult and a cult leader, and the cult leader dies, someone else has to come in to take over. That's why someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who doesn't impress me even the tiniest itty-bitty little bit, can instantly Just literally walk onto the stage, say, "This is my name," and bam, there he is. Everything he says gets quoted in the junk news. Everything he says he gets his face on TV. He gets in magazines. He didn't do anything. He just stepped into Carl Sagan's shoes. All right, that's just one example of what cult mentalities can do. Meanwhile, there's people out there conducting real science who are coming up with extraordinary insights into how this world works, and you don't hear a word about them because this pop culture cult mentality will not let them speak to the masses. You have to really hunt to find those people. So that's just a general overview of what the danger of cults is. And I'll say from my own perspective, if you've watched my videos on the Homeless Consultant channel, Minnesota as a state behaves like a cult. And a very vicious cult, a deadly cult. When you talk about, this is the epitome of, if you're an outsider, then you are to be avoided, persecuted, exploited, looted, possibly exterminated, if at all possible. Minnesota is a perfect example of that. And you have to watch my videos to see how something like that is possible. But it goes back to the original tribalism of the people who founded this place. They came from an extremely tribal background, and they carried it into the United States of America, where that degree of cult-like tribalism did not belong. But they didn't integrate with the rest of the culture. Instead, they said, we're us, they are them, we'll stay here, you stay there. And if you enter our area, you're fair game. Exactly what L. Ron Hubbard called people outside of Scientology. Fair game. They may be looted, they may be sued, they may be persecuted, they may be destroyed without any punishment to the Scientologist. That's what L. Ron Hubbard put in writing. And that's exactly how Minnesotans behave toward outsiders. It's a cult. All right. California has also become a cult by a totally different method. Totally different. They didn't move here as a tribe that grew into this horrific cult. California had cult leaders come in and literally take them over and start pulling their strings. That's a whole different way of going about it. Cult mentality helps to explain so many of the things that we see in this country today. When we look at something that makes no rational sense and you think, how can people... why is there no outcry against this? This is insane. Cult mentality explains it. Number 2, existential threat to America today is political correctness. Political correctness seeks to control and restrict free speech. In other words, one person is trying to dictate the terms of existence for another person. If that sounds familiar, you may have encountered something like that in, let's say, human slavery, for example. When one person says, I don't like the way they're speaking, so rather than learning how to deal with it like a civilized adult who's competent, socially competent, rather than doing that, or rather than learning how to deal with it as a responsible citizen who lives according to our Constitution, which guarantees free speech. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to build this powerful machine that somehow, some way, puts the equivalent of a loaded gun to people's heads and forces them to speak the way that I personally want them to speak. Because I'm offended when they speak the way that they want to speak. And I'm me. You see, they're not me. I'm me. So you will do it my way or the highway. That's political correctness. This has nothing to do with not offending people. This has everything to do with people who are easily offended, being offended in the first place by just common ordinary speech. Those are the people with the problems. Political correctness annihilates natural social intercourse. Because natural social intercourse requires every individual to behave the way that comes natural to them. If somebody's a racist, I want them to call black people niggers. I want them to do that. You know why? Because when they do that, I know they're a racist. I don't want somebody who is a racist to be forced at gunpoint to go around saying African American, when in their mind they're thinking nigger. I want them to say the word, then I know where they stand. I want them to be free to speak naturally, because they're going to reveal more about themselves when they do that. Political correctness says, no, you must say African American, even if you're thinking something else. Sorry folks, that doesn't work. All that does is it reduces the power of language itself to communicate anything. Language communicates, verbal and nonverbal. And when people choose to use words like that, I know what they're like. When you force them not to use those words when they want to, I have no idea what they're like. That's the problem with political correctness. And if you don't have natural social intercourse, you can't have citizenship. If people can't interact anymore, if they're now in fear of just opening their mouths, then everything else falls apart from there. Working as teams, working toward goals, working to solve problems. I mean, the fundamental communication between these people is now done at gunpoint. If you can't even communicate normally, everything else is at risk. Political correctness is devastating. That's why the First Amendment prohibited political correctness. It prohibited any restriction on free speech. The founders knew what they were doing. They had a whole history of the human species to draw upon for examples. They knew what they were doing. Political correctness also does some active things rather than passive. It deliberately promotes criticism. It promotes people criticizing others. You're trying to communicate something that you think is important to this person. So you start communicating. Now, if left alone, they would communicate it, they would grasp it, and they might communicate back. And they'll have a dialogue. And then they walk away with some new dialogue that they process that becomes a part of them. What happens with political correctness is they start speaking, and before they even get started, some third party comes in, sticks a gun to their head and says, you can't talk like that. Well, what were they even talking about originally? What was the idea that they were discussing between themselves? No one even remembers anymore, because now the whole thing is about, you can't talk like that, you can't use those words. Political correctness is a threat. It's a threat to humanity. If we can't communicate normally, we're doomed. But political correctness deliberately promotes these two people talking to put a wedge between them. It promotes division. It promotes criticism. It promotes insincerity. Rather than you using the language that you want to, you're going to use this other language that this person over here with the gun told you to use. That's insincere. You're not using the language you want to use to explain what you're trying to say. Political correctness promotes bitter division. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Those who promote political correctness have been deliberately dividing this country at the fundamental level, the level of communication between one person and another person. These people need to be stopped. Political correctness needs to go away, as if our lives depended on it. Because of all this, political correctness in the private sector, it clearly violates the spirit of the First Amendment, the purpose of the First Amendment. It violates that. And when you do that, you are guilty of committing sedition. Sedition is a capital offense. When the government as an institution enforces political correctness, it is violating the letter of the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law restricting the free exercise, free speech. When those institutions start passing these laws, to restrict free speech, they're violating the letter of the First Amendment. When you do that after taking an oath to to uphold the Constitution, you have betrayed the people, you have committed treason. That is a capital offense. Now, just as a thought experiment, imagine when political correctness really started getting big, around the 80s in particular. When I first saw it, I thought, this is the dumbest fad I have seen yet. I saw disco, I saw bell bottoms, I have seen some stupid things in my young life. Political correctness is the most insane. When is this stupidity going to be over? But it never ended. Imagine that the government came out in the early 80s when this first started. They came out and they started putting these people in their place. They started prosecuting them. They refused to enforce at gunpoint, because the government has a really big gun. They refused to enforce these ridiculous dictates that you use this word instead of that word. How far would political correctness have gone? It would have gone the way of bell bottoms. Our government was complicit in this, and nobody was held accountable. A responsible government would have enforced the Constitution and protected the people from this threat, but they didn't do it. Instead, they got scared, they got terrified, they were so afraid of the gun that these crazy lunatics from PC were holding at their heads, that instead of standing up and defending their families and their nation and themselves, they just caved in. And all it takes is one generation being raised with something for them to believe that it's normal, even if it is insane. When government officials, specific individuals within government, when they support political correctness, they are literally betraying their oaths of office to uphold the Constitution. That is a betrayal of the people. That is treason. It is a capital offense. Imagine if this had been enforced as the capital offenses that they are back in the 80s. There would be no such thing as political correctness today. And those of you who are old enough to remember what life was like before it, you understand what a beautiful, beautiful thing that is, don't you? But those kids who have been raised in political correctness, they have no comprehension of what freedom is even like. They can't even conceive of it. That's the devastation of political correctness. We need to fight against political correctness as if it were a domestic enemy of the United States of America. And the reason is because it is a domestic enemy of the American people. It's a divide and conquer tactic of people who want to destroy the United States of America. Number 3 is the undermining of the U.S. Constitution, both in the private sector and within government. Businesses, workplaces, and schools all, as I just mentioned, restrict free speech in blind service to this cult of political correctness. That violates the First Amendment. Businesses, workplaces, and schools ban guns, which are constitutionally protected by the Second Amendment. Businesses, workplaces, and schools, they will search your personal possessions on their property. Now that violates the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. Search and seizure without due process, without just cause. Now you can argue points to the end of time, oh, well, these are private places, they can do what they want. Perhaps. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Particularly with schools. This is the reason why. When it comes to schools in particular, the reason that they're doing all this is because they want to train the children to believe that the Constitution itself is not worthy of any respect. That it's a throwaway document. That no matter what it says, you don't have to actually obey it. You don't have to go through the due process of changing it if there's something in there you don't like. You just ignore it. You just violate it. You subvert it. You betray it. And you betray all the people who are protected by it without any consequences whatsoever. That's what children are trained in school as. They ban guns in school, the guns that will defend them against a school shooting, for example. Those guns. They ban free speech, the free speech that will let each student know exactly who their fellow students are because they're choosing their own words. And when they choose their own words, you know what you're dealing with. The Fourth Amendment, illegal search. What business do they have searching people? This just sets children up to feel like no matter where they go, someone can come up to them and say, "Show me your papers." Something that I never once experienced as a child. when we were still free. When it comes to these new tech companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these, they engage in wanton censorship. Anybody whose opinion they don't like, they censor out by a wide variety of means. They make sure that you don't even know they exist. If they become too big, they just dump them. They get rid of them. Now, if Google were a small search engine like it was back in 1997, and you had Yahoo and Google and AskJeeves.com, and you had all these search engines competing with each other, Google could then do something like that because they're a private business. And then the law of supply and demand would take over, and most people who have any kind of human dignity at all would say, Google sucks, I'm out of here, I'm going over to Yahoo, and Google goes away. See, that's how fair competition works. The evil things are abandoned by consumers, and they go away. And instead of Google, it would be something else. Ask Jeeves, Yahoo, or something we haven't even heard of. Something better than Google. The problem is, Google has become a monopoly. There are no effective alternatives to Google at this point. They own YouTube, they own everything. Gmail. There are no effective alternatives if you're trying to reach the kind of mass audience that it's possible to reach on the internet. There is no other way to reach that mass audience. At that point, they become something completely different. That's why we have antitrust suits in America, or at least we used to, and we should have them. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they are undermining the Constitution. They are completely rejecting the spirit of the First Amendment. The spirit of the First Amendment is the law of the land. Therefore, they are completely rejecting the law of the land. That is lawlessness. It is sedition, a capital offense. And in a capital offense, the person is executed. Google needs to be broken up and destroyed. Facebook needs to be broken up and destroyed. They need to be sent to the gallows with the noose and publicly, so that everyone can see what happens when you try to destroy the country that you're in from within, and they're to be destroyed. Sedition is a capital offense. I am censored on Google. What I'm saying right here will be censored by Google. If there was truly fair competition, excuse me, instead of Justin Bieber riding a skateboard or some guy telling what it's like to drink a $20,000 milkshake showing up on the trending, it would rotate through randomly to see what that people actually want to watch. And who knows, it might be this video. But that ain't going to happen with Google, because Google's going to make sure this video never gets there. Unless, of course, they see this video and then they try to make the point. You see what I'm getting at? It's lunacy. All things being equal, this will never show up in Google's trending, YouTube's trending, because they censor. There's another group called the Freedom from Religion Foundation. These jobs, these maniacs, they claim to hate religion. So what did they do? They formed a religion to fight against the existence of religion. You see how that works, right? Remember number one, cults and cult mentalities. These guys, what they do is they band together because there's strength in numbers. Remember, tribalism. They band together, they bring in collective wealth so that they have more money as a group than this poor one person standing over here has. And they take all that money and they buy this huge gun called the American legal system. They load it, they cock it, and they stick it to this individual's head. And they say, we're going to sue you. We're going to sue you if you continue to display that cross in public, or whatever it is they don't like. And the person here starts shaking in mortal fear, and if they don't just pass out, faint, or die out of sheer terror, have a heart attack, they cave in because you can't win against a gun that's that big. The Freedom from Religion Foundation behaves like a cult, which is a religion, you see. So every religion except theirs is acceptable. Gee, doesn't that sound, or is unacceptable? Doesn't that sound familiar? Sounds a little bit like Islam, right? You will either, here's the gun, here's the knife to your throat. Are you going to accept Allah, or are we going to saw your head off? Because those are your two choices. You don't have a third one. Because it's our religion, or it's nothing. That's what the Freedom from Religion Foundation does. It is a religion. It's a cult. And it wields the American legal system as a weapon against American citizens. A nation that defends its citizens would defend itself against somebody who points a weapon at American citizens. You see how this works, right? This nation should be shutting down the Freedom from Religion Foundation and putting the people responsible for it inside a prison because they're committing sedition, a capital offense. Likewise, the American Civil Liberties Union, which claims to protect constitutional rights, but they only protect their interpretation of constitutional rights. If you go to them with, say, a totally legitimate complaint, but they don't really care about it, they'll tell you to take a hike. But if you somehow interpret the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to mean that you can slaughter unborn children, they're your group. They'll help you out. Again, cult mentalities, right? How about the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has, nothing really in particular to do with the South, nothing in particular to do with poverty, and frankly, they're a lawless organization, nothing to do with the law. Certainly not the rule of law. Southern Poverty Law Center, nothing to do with any of those things. See, it's called a euphemism when you use a word that to describe something because you can't use what accurately describes it. Southern Poverty Law Center, the only thing they really do, it's just this boiling cauldron of disinformation and misinformation, hatred, division, conflict. Just nothing comes out of that place except this pointless, depressing negativity. That's all it is. They don't defend anybody. They only attack people. We're going to create a list. We're going to put you on our list of bad people. We're going to put you on our list of hate groups because we, hate them. But we're not going to put ourselves on there because we're right and they're wrong. You see, it's a cult mentality, you see. That's what the Southern Poverty Law Center is. It's a cult. And in the exercise of their cult mentality, they subvert the Constitution of the United States of America. That is sedition. It is a capital offense. Nobody's enforcing this. Nobody's defending the American people against these domestic enemies. Creditors and collection agencies. How about them? They violate the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits involuntary servitude as punishment for a non-criminal offense. Well, guess what? If you don't pay a debt, that's not a crime. It's a civil matter. It's a non-criminal offense. And yet, what do? They terrorize people, call them up every day. Excuse me, it is freezing cold here. It really got cold fast. They call up people and terrorize them. When I was writing the book on this issue back in the 90s, one example was the collection agent who called up. The mother wasn't home, and I think it was an 8 or 9-year-old child who answered the phone. They actually they terrorized this kid. We're going to take your home. You're going to be sleeping on the streets. They terrorized this kid into grabbing her mother's lipstick and writing, "My parents are deadbeats" on the wall in lipstick. These collection agencies can go out and garnish your wages, which means that you do the work, but before that money ever reaches you, it's not like the money reaches you through your paycheck and then by due process that money's taken away from you to pay a debt. That's not what happens. It's intercepted on its way to you. It's called garnishment. That means that you're working and somebody else directly receives the fruits of your labor. That is called involuntary servitude. That's exactly what the 13th Amendment prohibits. What these creditors and collection agencies are doing is undermining the Constitution. They're committing sedition, a capital offense. And nobody's doing anything about it. All they have is this ridiculous Fair Debt Collections Practices Act, which is a complete farce. Does nothing, accomplishes nothing. It's a fake, it's a fraud. You see, when the government fails to protect people from those who commit sedition in this manner by undermining the Constitution in the private sector, when the government fails to protect us from those people, we have a situation that is called lawlessness. And that means that our government officials are negligent, they are incompetent, they are corrupt, they're lazy bums, at the very least. Speaking of the government, how about our education system again? Our education system rewrites history. It doesn't tell the truth about what happened in the past. It promotes disrespect and hatred of the United States and its Constitution and its foundational institutions. Everything from the family to the military. That's what our school system does today. That's a government institution. Undermining the Constitution. What about judges legislating from the bench? It's not their job. They took an oath of office, but their oath says that you are a judge, not a legislator. We elect people to be our legislators. That way we can change them and remove them and hold them accountable. You were appointed. You have no business legislating. Even if you're an elected judge, you're still part of the judiciary, not the legislature. When you step outside that bounds, you're committing treason. You are violating your oath of office. You're betraying the people. I don't understand how people can't grasp this. It's really straightforward, cut and dried. Actually, I do understand why people don't get it, because cult mentalities have tempered the kind of anger, that righteous anger that people would have had in the past against judges doing something like that, or schools doing something like that. Government agencies, they ban guns on public property. Public property. Second Amendment says you shall pass no law restricting, the right to keep and bear arms. Keep and bear arms. Keep and bear arms. Have a gun and carry it on your person. No restrictions. No registration. No papers that you have to show. You just carry your weapon wherever you want to. And so does everybody else. And you know what happens in that case? When some wise guy decides to stand up and say, I'm going to kill everybody here, everybody there can defend themselves. And he doesn't get very far. But instead what we have is a government who has said, nope, you can't carry these guns, even though the Constitution says you can. So now the only person who walks in the door heavily armed is the guy who wants to kill everybody, who are now totally defenseless. You see how this works, right? You see how this works. Only a cult mentality can make people be so irrational that they think gun control is going to protect you from people with guns. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any rational sense, you see. When the government bans guns on public property, they are violating the Second Amendment. That is a betrayal of the American people. It's a violation of their oath of office. It is treason, a capital offense. And to defend the American people, anyone who bans guns on a public property, they should receive the punishment due to those who commit treason against their nation. Because they are literally forcing the American people to become defenseless, when before they were defended. Why aren't we putting these people where they belong? I don't see one of them going to a prison, let alone going to the gallows. No wonder we have nothing but mass shootings all over the place. No wonder. Because they can. Before, they couldn't do it because there's all these armed people to stop them. But now, they've got free reign to shoot everybody they want. No wonder there's a bunch of mass shootings. Duh! You see, cult mentality can make people believe things that make no rational sense. Things that are not consistent with reality. I'll tell you a quick story. When I lived in California, I went to Riverside, and I went into this, I was working on a documentary film at the time, so I was trying to speak, because Riverside is where the state of California gets its leaders of social services for the most part. They always seem to come out of Riverside, because Riverside has the biggest machine, money grab in terms of social services. So I went there, and I went into a particular building, and it had these signs that said, guns are banned on these premises. And I went into the person working the desk there, and I said, I got a question about that sign over there. It says guns are banned. If you ban guns, doesn't that mean that everybody in here is undefended when someone who doesn't really care what that sign says brings a whole bag of guns in here? And the person just like snarled their nose and blew it off like that. That building was the same building, San Bernardino, where they had that mass shooting. What was it, about 8 years later, after I was there asking that question? The same building. Cult mentality makes you think irrationally. Had those people been defended, maybe nobody would have died, certainly fewer. Minnesota Department of Health, if you watched my videos, the Minnesota Department of Health came to a hotel I was staying in. I paid for a hotel room. They came up, banged on the door like a Gestapo. They were literally wearing gang jackets. Told me to get out of that room while they searched the room, claiming to be doing some kind of health inspection. The problem is I had paid for that room as a consumer. If they had an issue with the hotel, that's their business, but they had no issue with me. These guys throwing their weight around forced me to step outside in my shorts in the cold while some total stranger walked in and sniffed my underwear or whatever they were doing. I'm sorry, but that violates the Fourth Amendment. Those people in the Minnesota Department of Health who did that, they betrayed their trust, they betrayed the American people, they violated the Fourth Amendment. That is treason, a capital offense. And yet, I'm the one still sleeping in this car, and those people still have that kind of power in the Minnesota state government. Do you see the problem yet? Do you see why I listed this as one of the threats, an existential threat to the United States of America? Alright, so beyond that, I will just point out that all of this contributes to another one of these threats that I'll get to later, which I call lawlessness. When you have laws everywhere, policies, procedures, rules, but they're just selectively enforced, or they're ignored, or when it isn't a rule of law, you have lawlessness. And that's what we have here. We have a constitution that it isn't even possible to make it more clear on what it says. Shall pass no law restricting free speech, the right to keep and bear firearms. It couldn't be more clear if you tried. And yet we have all these laws restricting free speech, restricting the right to keep and bear arms. And nobody's doing anything about it. A country that allows that to happen isn't going to last that long. There's a reason the Constitution put those protections there in the first place. And if we're that easy to get rid of them, we're going to lose the protections, and we're going to suffer the consequences, because we will be defenseless. And that is not what the founders wanted for us. And you know what? It's getting kind of bone-chilling cold and wet out here. I'm going to stop this video to warm up a bit and continue it a little later. Alright? I will be back.